Hello everybody, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and as I am a big Roman history person, I am decided to do a tier list for the best to the worst Roman emperors, and this is not made by me, this list itself, and the emperors, but it's made by someone else, but we're going to be using it anyway. So, Aelia, she was, for a woman of her time, able to basically wield a lot of power, and I believe she was one of the main sources of power in the East during the reign of Emperor Arcadius, the son of Theodosius. And she's also, I believe, a saint. However, I'm not going to put her too high up, despite her accomplishments as a woman of her time, but I'm going to put her only in maybe the okay emperors, because she was able to do a lot within her boundaries. Now, Aemilianus is mediocre because he barely lasted. He was deposed very shortly after he assumed the imperial title. Now, Anthemis, he's actually one of the last capable emperors of the West. He had a couple of efforts to try to restore the Western Roman Empire to its former glory after it was basically on the brink of collapse. However, this wasn't necessarily successful, yet he was still a good emperor, and he at least tried to restore an empire that was on the verge of collapse, and the empire itself didn't collapse under him, and he managed to hold what was left of the empire together, so that for that reason I'm putting him in this spot on the list. Now, Antonius Pius, he's one of the 5 good emperors, so he's going to be up on the great emperors list. Arcadius, he's one of the worst emperors. He was just like his brother. They were incompetent, and they were basically puppets in which other members of the nobility would hold power over these puppet emperors. And Augustus, of course, the first emperor, first citizen, he's going to be the best of all of the Roman emperors, of course. Well, I'm pretty sure if you know Roman history, you're going to know Augustus. I mean, member of the Second Triumvirate, the heir of Julius Caesar himself, and he managed to defeat his rivals, such as Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium, and his reign marked the beginning of the Roman Empire, and an empire that would last over 1,000 years if you're also counting Byzantium. Now, he did a lot of reforms to help instill disciplinary in the citizenry, and as well as managing to have successful diplomacy. The only thing that was unsuccessful was his attempt at conquering Germania, but that was because of Varus, Publius Quinctilius Varus. It's not entirely his fault. Augustus is the first and the best. Now, Aurelian is also going to be one of the best emperors because he basically saved the empire from the brink of collapse in the crisis of the 3rd century, where the empire basically fragmented into separatist states such as the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east, as well as the looming threat of the barbarians such as the Alemanni, and as well as the Sassanid Empire in the east. And Aurelian managed to repel. He started off just as an ordinary soldier, and he became emperor after Claudius Gothicus died of plague, of a disease, and Aurelian managed to basically defeat the Alemanni and other barbarian tribes in a series of battles, saving the empire's borders there. And then he reconquered the Palmyrene Empire, which at that time was under the rule of Zenobia, and then he reconquered the Gallic Empire in the west. Now, he only reigned for 5 years before he was assassinated, and due to his accomplishments in those 5 years, I'm going to put them. He is one of the best emperors. I'm not sure if any of these other emperors could have done what he did if they were in his situation. Now, Avitus, he's not really an emperor that you would think of as good or terrible. So that's for that reason I'm only going to be putting him in mediocre. Same thing with this guy, Balbinus. Now, Caligula. Caligula has a very negative name when people talk about the Roman Empire. Caligula is one of the worst emperors that people are always talking about. Like, for example, let's say I go to my school and I ask my friends who is the worst emperor of Rome. They're going to either say Nero or Caligula, and they were, in fact, mad emperors. But in my opinion, they're not necessarily the worst of the worst. I mean, they're some of the worst emperors due to some of their decisions, their decision making. As Caligula, I'm not sure he was really fit to be emperor, but he didn't cause the collapse of an empire, is at least a good thing, one positive thing. And Caligula actually started off his reign kind of well, but it's because he succumbed to a disease that basically mentally altered him and turned him into the madman that we remember him as today. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm putting him in the worst tier simply because of some of his decisions, such as, for example, I believe that he tried to make his horse a senator. Now, if that, I'm not sure whether or not that's just a myth, but the story does have a ring to it. And Caligula also had a lot of other decisions, and his reign is known as kind of the days of terror in Rome, but then he was eventually killed by his own bodyguard. But I'm going to put him above Arcadius, simply because at least he was able to hold the empire together, and he didn't, like, totally screw the empire over. Now, Caracalla also has a similar situation to Caligula, and Caracalla is known as one of the other. I wouldn't call Caracalla a mad emperor. It's just that he was cruel, and he tried to re-emulate his hero Alexander the Great in basically a failed campaign in the East. But he's not as bad as Caligula, so I'm going to just put him in the high worst tier. Now, Carinus. Some of these I'm not familiar with because there are so many emperors. Like Carinus, I'm not too familiar with this guy, but I have a feeling he's not not one of the good emperors, but he's not one of the bad emperors either. So I'm gonna just put him in the okay list. Carus, he was just an okay guy. Claudius Gothicus. Now, this guy inherited the Christ. He's Aurelian's predecessor, and he inherited an empire on the brink of collapse in the 3rd century. Now, Claudius Gothicus, he eventually would succumb to a plague and die before he could actually try to reconquer the lost territories, but he was a competent emperor who held the empire together through its most difficult years, and he managed to repel barbarian invasions as well as keep the empire safe. And for that reason, I'm going to put him in the good emperors list. It's kind of ironic that this guy's above, but he's a great emperor. Now, the next guy we have is Claudius. He's one of the most underrated emperors that people don't necessarily talk about in a positive tone a lot. Claudius, Aurelian, Majorian, those guys are very underrated. Julian. Now, Claudius, he had disability, but he inherited the empire after Caligula died, and he's known as Uncle Claudius for a reason. And under Claudius's reign, the Romans conquered Britain. Now, I'm not going to say that he was one of the great emperors or the best emperors, but he was a good emperor. He was competent, and managed to steer the empire in the right direction, despite his personal challenges. And for that reason, I'm putting him over here. Now, Commodus is also one of the bad emperors. According to many historians, it's during the reign of Commodus that the Roman Empire began its decline. The golden age of the empire ended with Commodus. The Pax Romana ended with Commodus. And Commodus is worse than Caligula or Caracalla, in my opinion, because the guy was more interested in entertainment than actually ruling, unlike his father Marcus Aurelius. Now, Commodus, as you all may know, he would fight in the arena because he believed that he was a reincarnation of his Greek hero Heraclius, or the Roman name Hercules. And I'm going to put him, since he was not a good emperor, he would eventually be strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner, Narcissus. And for that reason, he's one of the worst emperors. He was also very cruel and paranoid as well. Now, Constans II, he's mediocre. Constans, he's also in mediocre. Like, they weren't necessarily anything, you know? They were really just footnotes in the empire's history. Like, a lot of these guys are just footnotes in the empire's history. Constantine III, I believe he was a usurper who, during the later years of the declining empire, he tried to usurp power, but he eventually would fail. Constantine II, I'm going to put him maybe at a low okay list. Now, Constantine the Great, I believe yes, he was great. I mean, he was able to steer the empire in a good direction after the civil wars after the Tetrarchy basically collapsed and its members basically were fighting each other. He managed to unite the empire. But I'm putting him in the great emperors list. However, in my true opinion, he's really he's not as good as Pius, Aurelian, or Augustus. He's not at that level. But he is a good emperor. He's a great emperor, in my opinion, as he managed to unify the empire after defeating Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge. And since Christianity was the empire, even though it tried to stop Christianity numerous times, it couldn't really stop it, and Constantine decided to just legalize it anyway because there was no need for the trouble of persecuting the Christians, even though they did prove troublesome to the empire on many occasions. There's really no benefit from doing it. So Constantine and his reforms, and he moved the empire's capital to Constantinople, which would basically lead the empire into a new beginning, as the Byzantines would also rule in Constantinople after the West would fall. But Constantine is going to be just in this, and he's a great emperor, but not the best. Constantius Cloris, he's a somewhat decent emperor. He was at least able to hold it together. He was, I believe, a member of a division after Constantine's death of the Tetrarchs. Now, Constantius III, he was actually a good emperor, and he was a good general, actually. He managed to quell a lot of different rebellions from various different usurpers during the later years of the empire, and he succeeded one of the worst emperors, Honorius. But he only ruled for a short time, and if he had lived longer and didn't succumb to a disease, he could have become he could have been a great emperor, because he was a good general, but simply because he wasn't able to live long enough, he's only going to be in the good emperors. And that's not his fault that he didn't live long enough. It's just nature caught up to him or something. Now, but due to his successes on the field and in trying to restore peace, I'm putting him in a good emperors list. Now, Constantius the Second. This guy, I have mixed opinions about him. He unified the empire, which is a good thing. However, he was also, I should say, He was also a bit of a paranoid ruler as well. So for that reason, I'm just going to put him in the okay list. I mean, he managed to defeat a rival in the west, but lost a lot of troops in a costly battle. And then he would eventually, although he would make the right decision in the end and leave the empire to his successor Julian. Now, the next guy we have Decius. Decius probably, it's from the look of it, probably just mediocre. Ditus Julianus. He's a barrack emperor, and he's just there. Now, Diocletian, he's a great emperor. His reforms helped to end the crisis of the 3rd century. There's a saying I like to say that Aurelian reunified the empire, and Diocletian, what should I say, finalized it. Now, the years after Aurelian's death, the empire would spring into a new round of the crisis, but then Diocletian would defeat his rivals and became the ruler of the Roman Empire. And he would set up the Tetrarchy, which was basically a system where there were multiple emperors for different regions of the empire, and each of those emperors would also have a subordinate known as a Caesar. And Diocletian would rule part of the East, and Diocletian managed to the Tetrarchy was very successful under Diocletian, actually. It brought the empire peace, a much needed peace, after many years of unrest and infighting. And Diocletian, he is a great emperor. Maybe he wasn't the nicest guy towards the Christians, aka the Great Persecution, but for the empire's sake, he was a great emperor. Now, over here we have Domitian. And Domitian is one of the most, I should say, misunderstood emperors. He's known to us, to most of us, as a paranoid and cruel ruler. However, I would say that he was a good emperor, actually. I would say that, despite maybe other people objecting, but because his reforms actually did a lot of good to the empire. And the reason why he was so paranoid was because of how corrupt the Senate was. It's not his fault that he was paranoid. It's because the Senate of Rome was at the time still corrupt, and they were very scheming people. And because of that, Domitian and his reforms were not popular with the Senate or the nobility, but they were good for the empire itself. Now, Domitian would eventually be betrayed and killed, but simply, but he is a good emperor in my opinion, and that's why he's over there. Now, this guy, Agallabus, he is one of the mad emperors, and for that reason, he's the worst. Now, the empire didn't exactly um, go anywhere, didn't necessarily decline or anything like that under his rule. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't leading the empire into a state of total collapse or anything like along those lines. The empire actually was peaceful under Agallabus's reign, but Agallabus, as many of you may know, had very, I should say, unhealthy tastes. He did a lot of strange and very, as we call it, inappropriate things. And he was very well, he's known as he basically tried to, I believe, either promote a religion or make himself a god, all the while being a very, he was acting the opposite of his, you know, and because of that, because of his odd tastes, you notice how I'm comfortable when talking about this guy, because he did quite a few things that were not okay. And I'm not saying like Caligula or anything, but I'm saying like basically the polar opposite. He's kind of the polar opposite. Caligula was cruel, but this guy was more, he had a lot of inappropriate tastes. He's the polar opposite of Caligula. But he's not necessarily so bad. I'm going to put him above Caligula because the empire still remained peaceful under his reign. Didn't lead the empire anywhere bad. It's just, as a person, he was not okay. Now, Eugenius, I believe, just another would-be usurper. Florianus, just another guy. Galba, I believe he was during the Year of the Five Emperors, which after the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended with the death of Nero. Galba took power, but these years of the Five Emperors were full of instability and unrest, and Galba was eventually killed. So that for that reason, I'm just gonna put him in the high mediocre tier because like he was something, but he's not one of the good emperors or even okay emperor. Now Gallerius, I'd say Gallerius. He was an okay emperor, I believe, if I'm remembering the context correctly. Now Gallienus was actually a good emperor. I'm going to put him just above Gothicus for that one. And Gallienus was the emperor during the crisis of the 3rd century. He was the emperor before Claudius Gothicus, and Gallienus basically held the empire together and won a number of military victories against the barbarian tribes, but it's just that he was unable to stop Postumus in Gaul from seceding. But in the end, he was actually quite successful. If he had lived longer and wasn't assassinated, he could have actually somewhat reunited the empire. So for that reason, I'm going to put him as a good emperors. But him and Claudius Gothicus, they just didn't live. It's simply because Aurelian managed to be the guy that finally unified it. That's why Aurelian's up there, and these guys are just over here. Geta, I just put him as the mediocre. I'm just gonna change that real quick. Now, Glycyricus. There's so many guys. A lot of these emperors that I'm putting in the mediocre list, they're really just footnotes in history. They're like footnotes in the empire that no one really cares about, no one really thinks about, unless you're really deep into it. Same thing with Gordian, and Gordian. 3 Gordians. Gratian, probably just a mediocre emperor. Hadrian, very good emperor. He's one of the 5 good emperors. In the 5 good emperors, if you don't know who those guys are, they are Hadrian, Antonius Pius, Lucius Verus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius. Now, Hadrian, he managed to suppress the 3rd Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire, the Bar Kokhba revolt, and then he ended the province of Judea completely, because Judea was a very, very unruly and rebellious province. It already had 2 rebellions before then against the Romans, and Hadrian just got tired and he decided to put an end to it all. And Hadrian also had a lot of reforms that helped the empire maintain peace and stability, and he is a great emperor, Hadrian, one of my favorite emperors. And Herennius Etruscus is just another mediocre emperor, footnote in history. Now this guy here, he's my least favorite emperor of them all, Honorius. And Honorius, he assumed the title of emperor when, I guess I shouldn't totally look down on Honorius, because it's not entirely his fault that he was put into the throne as a child. It's simply because his father Theodosius split the empire between him and his brother Arcadius over here, who's right next to him in the worst tier list. And Honorius, he is the guy that he assumed the empire, and under his reign, he didn't really make his decisions on his own. He let the nobility kind of rule over him, and that would lead to a lot of things. And under Honorius, the empire at first was fine, because Honorius's guardian was a brilliant half-Vandal general named Flavius Stilicho, and Stilicho managed to defeat Visigothic invasions by Alaric a number of times actually, and save the empire and hold a divided empire together. But then Honorius kills him. He had him executed on a false charge of treason. And without Stilicho, Honorius's empire pretty much almost collapsed. It's lucky that Rome didn't fall under his reign. And Alaric would sack Rome, and there's a famous tale here that when Rome was sacked, and the news of that was delivered to Honorius. Honorius was very sad because he thought that his favorite chicken, also named Rome, was hurt or something. And when the messengers told him that the chicken was fine, he was relieved, even though the city of Rome itself had been sacked and laid to ruin, and its citizens were put under the brutality of the Gothic horde. And that's because of all his incompetence and all of his bad decisions putting him down there. And the reason why the Goths got powerful enough to sack Rome, well, when they killed the half Vandal, when he killed his Stilicho, and he would also, under the orders of a noble named Olympius, kill a number of barbarians families living in the empire in a manic genocide. And because of that, a lot of the barbarian troops that served Stilicho and the Roman army would shift over to Alaric, and then Alaric was able to march on Rome because of that. So this guy, he's the worst emperor. Hostilian, I'd say this guy's just maybe an okay emperor. Joannes, he's an okay emperor. Jovian inherited difficult decision because after Julian the Apostate was killed in his campaign, he was forced to cede territory, but that's just not his fault. And at least he managed to hold it together, is what I'm saying. Now Julian, this guy is another one of the underrated Roman emperors. He's a relative of Constantine the Great, and Julian would serve under the Emperor Constantius II and managed to score a huge military victory over an Alemanni confederation at the Battle of Strasbourg. And this is Julian's high point, is his huge victory at Strasbourg. I apologize for that notification. Julian effectively saved the empire and won what is one of the last great victories of the West against the barbarians. It was a crushing defeat for the Alemanni, one that they would not recover from ever. And Julian would assume the title of emperor after Constantius died, and Julian embarked on a campaign against the Sassanid Persian Empire in the east, and initially he was successful, but then his supplies began to run out, and then he was killed, wounded from a wound in battle. Now, there are different sources as to how this Julian died, but Julian could have been killed by just fighting against Sassanids, or he was killed by a Christian within his ranks. Now, he's one of the good emperors in my opinion. Underrated, pretty good. Put him just below Domitian. And speaking of Christians, what Julian did was known as Julian the Philosopher, but Christians call him Julian the Apostate because he's known as the last true pagan emperor of Rome, and he tried to reverse the policies of Constantine and his successors in making Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. And Julian supported paganism. He was a pagan himself because he had rejected Christianity, and because of that, he's viewed in a negative way by a lot of people because of his paganism, but I think he was a good emperor in my opinion. The Sassanid campaign really just caused his ultimate failure, even though he was somewhat successful at first, but in the end he was killed in campaign. Now Julius Nepos, he was an emperor and then he was deposed, and then he tried to mount a resistance against. So Julius Nepos was an emperor of the Western Roman Empire, but then he was deposed and then replaced with, I believe, Romulus Agustolus, the last Roman emperor of the West. And after the West effectively fell, Nepos would try to mount a resistance in Dalmatia, but then he would be betrayed and killed. So I'm guessing that if it wasn't for it's just due to situations. He's just going to be in the low okay emperor. He was an okay. He's nothing drastic, but it's just he was alive when the West technically fell. Leo the Thracian is also just an okay emperor. Nothing much. He lived quite a while though. and the Eastern Empire was prosperous under his reign, and the West was ripping itself to pieces. Leo II, guessing just an okay emperor. He's just an Eastern Emperor, and he's an okay Eastern Emperor. Libius Severus, he's just mediocre Emperor. Licinius, he's an okay Emperor. Lucius Verus, one of the 5 good emperors, and I'm going to put him in the great emperors list. He helped the empire prosper throughout the reigns of the Nerva Antonine dynasty. Macrinus, he's mediocre. Magentius, Magnus Maximus. I think Magnus Maximus was a usurper. I'm just going to put him in the mediocre. Majorian. This guy's story makes me sad. Majorian. Majorian was the last, I'd say, great emperor of the West, other than Anthemis, but he was before Anthemis, and the West lost a lot of territories. Majorian managed to reconquer a lot, but then his Germanic general Ricimer, who at first put Majorian on the throne because he was going to use him as a puppet, but then Majorian turned out to be the exact opposite of a puppet and actually a competent emperor who managed to reconquer a lot of the lost territories in the West. Ricimer would betray Majorian and then have him killed, and the historian Edward Gibbon states that Majorian represents the welcome discovery of heroic character such as arises during the human degenerate age. I'm not sure, I don't think those are the exact words, but it's close to that. Marcian, mediocre. Marcus Aurelius. Now, this guy is one of the 5 good emperors. Put him above Verus. Probably one of the top, because his reign, despite his reign was marked by a lot of war against the Marcomanni, one of the Germanic tribes, known as the Marcomannic Wars. But his reign is considered to be a golden age for Rome, because he was a very wise emperor. He's also a famous philosopher emperor as well. So for all of his accomplishments, I'm putting him as a great emperor. Not one of the best, but he was great. Now, Maxentius is going to be in mediocre. He lost to Constantine at the battle. Maximian, he was one of the members of the Tetrarchy of Diocletian's creation, and he was one of the, I think, the emperor of the West. So, but he wasn't like a good emperor or anything, but he was just okay. This guy here, Thrax, I believe he is an okay emperor. Nero. Now this guy also gets a lot of hate, like Caligula, Commodus, and Agallibus, but I'm going to put him in the high bottom tier, above Agallibus. Well, maybe below Agallibus, because Nero's reign was one of controversy, great controversy. He loved the arts, is what I'm saying. He promoted a lot of playwrights, musicians, all forms of entertainment flourished during Nero's reign. But Nero was also a mad emperor. He was a brutal man. I believe he killed his own mother because he feared that she was getting too powerful. Though, depending on the situation, it may have been justified because his mother may have been responsible for the deaths of previous emperors. Now, Nero's reign also began the persecution of Christians after he blamed them for a great fire that started in Rome that was likely made by Nero himself, because Nero wanted to start a new city. Now, Nerva of the Nerva Antonine dynasty, he's not one of the greats, but he's not one of the worst. He's just a mediocre. He started off the dynasty that would produce like the best emperors, though, so I'm putting him into okay. He was an emperor for his times. Numerian, okay list. Olybrius, he's irrelevant, so that's why I'm putting him mediocre. Otho is probably likely irrelevant. Pertinax is an okay emperor. Petronius Maximus, he's a mediocre. Philip II. It's not much. Like these emperors, like some of these are just like footnote emperors. Philip the Arab was an okay emperor. Not good, not bad, just okay. Probus is actually a good was actually a good emperor. He served under Restitutor Orbis Aurelian, and sources say he managed to reconquer Egypt for the Roman Empire, and he inherited also a crisis of the 3rd century, but he managed to somewhat restore peace in the empire, so I'm putting him in the good emperors list. Now, Pupanus, he's likely just a mediocre. We don't who knows who that guy is. Quintilius barely lasted. Him and Aemilianus like had really short reigns. Quintilius was killed again when Aurelian took power, and Aurelian either had him executed or Quintilius killed himself. Now Romulus Agustulus, this guy, I'm putting him in mediocre simply because he was the last emperor of the Roman Empire, but the reason why I'm not putting him above or below is simply because he just couldn't stop. He was just really nothing more than not much older than a kid actually when he was emperor, and then eventually deposed by barbarian Odoacer, which brought the end to the West, and he's the last emperor of the West. And Salonius is another mediocre. Septimus Severus, the Severan reforms in the military led to a much needed reorganization of Rome's armies. So Septimius Severus is one of the great emperors. Severus Alexander. This guy was eventually killed, and it started the crisis of the 3rd century, but that's not his fault that he got killed. He was actually just an okay emperor. Not great, not bad. Tacitus is just a mediocre emperor. We don't know. I have no idea. Some of them are. Theodosius II. This guy, I'm putting him just... Maybe he's an okay emperor. Now, Theodosius I. This guy is, in my opinion, overrated. He's called Theodosius the Great, but I don't think he's all that great, in my opinion. I mean, he was great for... He reunified the empire, and he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, which I guess was a good thing at the time, but his foreign policy had drastic consequences in the future of the empire. For example, he employed a lot of barbarian mercenaries into the Roman army, and because of that would lead to discontent among the ranks as the empire progressed, in rebellions numerous times. He also settled barbarians into the empire as well in order to carve peace. But there's a saying, a bad peace is worse than a war. A peace that's not worth it can be worse than a war in the long term, and Theodosius kind of represents that. Now, he was the last emperor that ruled over a united empire, and he wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't say a bad emperor, it's just he had a lot of bad decisions. He just made a lot of poor choices, but he wasn't mediocre or anything like that, but he's nowhere near good. So that's why I'm going to put him maybe like down here somewhere. Now Tiberius. This guy is another one of those decisions that's hard to make. You know what, I'm going to put Tiberius high okay tier above Nerva. I'm just going to have to move that real quick. There, okay, then. Tiberius was the second emperor of the Roman Empire after Augustus died, and Tiberius is known a lot to us as a paranoid and sullen, grumpy emperor who was never really happy. But I'd say Tiberius was not necessarily a bad emperor. Before he became emperor, he was a very accomplished general, actually. He managed to conquer a lot of the provinces for the Roman Empire and suppress rebellions, and he also had a successful campaign in Germania as well. Unlike Varus, he was actually successful in Germania. Now, Tiberius, when he became emperor, he was surrounded by nobles, scheming nobles, but despite that, I mean, he did make a lot of wrong decisions. Let's that's but that's fact. But in the end, Tiberius strengthened the empire, in my opinion. The empire was strong under the rule of Tiberius, but he's not one of the good, like the best emperors. But he's not one of the worst emperors. But he is on the high okay tier with Nerva, Constantius II, who are kind of similar to him as well. Titus was a good emperor. Putting him in the high good tier list. He managed to suppress the Great Jewish Rebellion, and the empire was very stable under his rule after he eventually got to don the purple. And now Trajan is going to be our third best emperor. And Trajan, under his reign, the empire was at its greatest extent. Trajan managed to conquer Mesopotamia for the empire. He had a very successful campaign against Dacia and conquered Dacia. And he's known as Optimus Princeps, the best emperor. And him and Augustus and him are known as the two greatest emperors of Rome. And the Senate would even, when a new Roman emperor was crowned, if that's the right term for it, they would say, luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. And simply because Trajan was such a good emperor. He was one of the 5 good emperors, and he is one of the best emperors. Trebonius Gallus, another mediocre guy. Opina Severina, Aurelian's wife. I say she was just okay. She's nothing bad, nothing good, although she did make the mistake of minting coins that would cause economic problems here and there. Valens, I wouldn't say he's a bad emperor or anything like that. He was just in the wrong situation at the wrong time, because he would be defeated by the Goths at Adrianople, but he's not one of the worst emperors in my opinion. Even after Adrianople, the empire didn't exactly fall or anything. Even though Adrianople was a decisive defeat in the open field for the Romans, Valens himself was killed in the battle. I think if Valens had made wiser decisions in waiting for his reinforcements, he could have won at Adrianople, but he didn't. But he's not like the worst or anything like that, but he's just an okay emperor. Valentinian III, one of the incompetents, alongside Arcadius and Honorius. Valentinian III. This guy also makes me angry, just like Honorius. Okay, so back when we were talking about Honorius, let's jump some years ahead, and the Roman Empire is facing not a Gothic threat, but they're facing a big threat, the Huns. The Huns under Attila have invaded the empire and are bringing the empire to its knees. Now, Roman general Flavius Aetius and some barbarian allies managed to rout the Hunnic army of Attila at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains or the Catalaunian Fields, or Chalon, depending on how you want to say it. And Valentinian III was the incompetent emperor at the time, and then he had Aetius killed. He killed Aetius himself, sources say, because he thought Aetius was plotting. He was tricked into thinking Aetius was plotting against him. And Aetius is another tragic hero of the empire, just like Stilicho, and Valentinian would be killed by Aetius's loyal men sometime later, so he's one of the worst emperors. Valentinian II is just an okay emperor. Valentinian I was actually a good emperor. He's not like, well, yeah, I'd say he was one of the good emperors. Under his reign, he managed to defend the empire successfully from the Germanic tribes, and he had such a hatred of the Germanic tribes that he died in an odd way, actually, when he got so angry at an envoy who insulted him that it's possible that a blood vessel burst in his brain and he died. But despite that odd incident, Valentinian did a lot of good for the empire in terms of maintaining control even amidst the pressure of the barbarians and invasions and enemies within. So he's one of the good emperors. Valentinian the First, Valentinian the Great. Valerian, captured by the Sassanids, wrong place, wrong time. His military defeat ended up with him being one of the first emperors to be the first emperor to be captured, actually. Now, Valerian was just an okay emperor. He wasn't terrible or anything. It's just that his defeat cost him his life. Valerius Severus, just a mediocre emperor. Vespasian, he built the Colosseum, and he was one of the rulers in the period of Roman peace, the Pax Romana. He brought peace, prosperity, and a lot of gains for the empire as well. And he was the guy that built the Colosseum. So, Varanio, another mediocre. Victor is mediocre. Vitellius, this guy he had an addiction to food, I believe, which is why he became very gluttonous. But it's not like the empire was in a feeble or bad state in his reign, so he's just an okay emperor. Nothing bad, nothing good. Volusianus, I'd say, is just an okay emperor. Now, Zeno, the last guy in the list, we have him. He's actually an Eastern Roman emperor, Now, he ruled at the same time that the West fell to Odoacer, and Zeno's reign was filled with a lot of unrest in the imperial court, as well as rebellions. And I mean, he had to try to suppress a religious schism known as the Monophysite Schism, and he managed to stop the Ostrogoths from invading by employing the Ostrogoth king Theodoric to actually invade Odoacer's realm, and Odoacer was put to the sword and killed. So he basically helped, through diplomacy, Zeno helped to protect the empire from Gothic invasions by sending the Goths to the west with a hefty bribe, I'm guessing. And Zeno's reign is filled with just, it's not easy for the guy. He's not like a great, but he's not bad either, so I'm just going to put him in the okay emperors tier list, as the majority of them are. And that concludes our list of the best emperors to the worst emperors. And we have great emperors, good emperors, okay emperors, mediocre emperors in between. Now, if this list included all Roman emperors from Augustus to Constantine XI, the last of the East, that would be a way, way long list. So that's why we just did Roman emperors up to the fall of the West. I'm wondering if there's one for the East, though, because that would be cool. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe. This was a little different from our normal routine of Total War, but I feel this was pretty enjoyable doing, and something I wanted to do for a while, so yeah.